Hi, everyone. In 1932, Americans went to the polls to cast their ballots for the President of the United States amidst the worst economic downturn in history. The Great Depression had battered the country, leaving over 15 million people unemployed. With over a quarter of the U.S. population jobless, the national mood was one of horrible despair. The man who the people chose to lead them was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR for short. Roosevelt had risen to political prominence as the governor of New York, and now in 1932, he captured the imagination of the public by preaching a New Deal for the American people. The New Deal began as a vague series of promises to improve the lives of the people. However, over the course of FDR's administration, it would begin to take shape with the help of reform-minded advisors such as FDR's cabinet and the Brain Trust. Now, the Brain Trust was a group of intellectuals, many of them college professors, who worked with Roosevelt to develop the policies that collectively became known as the New Deal. From the start, the New Deal was less a comprehensive plan and more of a series of experiments designed to battle the Great Depression. Some of it worked and some of it didn't, but all of it would redefine the role of government in the lives of the American people and establish a limited welfare state within America. When Roosevelt was inaugurated in March of 1933, he faced perhaps the greatest crisis in American history since the Civil War. The Great Depression was in its third year, and many wondered if it would ever end. Indeed, the Great Depression threatened to upend American democracy itself, and there were fears that fascism or communism would take over in the United States. Franklin Roosevelt seemed uniquely suited to handle the challenges of the Great Depression. First, because he had overcome struggles within his own life, most notably a bout with polio in 1921 that left him paralyzed from the waist down. Recovering from polio had humbled Roosevelt and instilled in him a strong sense of compassion and determination. FDR was also aided by his wife, Eleanor. Eleanor Roosevelt would become the most active First Lady in American history. As the conscience of the New Deal, Eleanor Roosevelt traveled across the country, visiting government institutions and New Deal program sites. She served as the eyes and ears of the president and pushed the president to take greater measures to help all Americans, advocating for civil rights for African Americans, promoting additional aid to the poor, and championing greater inclusion for women within the government. She would regularly hold press conferences in which she only invited female reporters, since female reporters were not allowed at the president's briefings. And Eleanor Roosevelt wrote a weekly syndicated newspaper entitled My Day, which gave her a platform to discuss topics that she cared about. Eleanor and FDR's political partnership would greatly influence the programs created by the New Deal. Now, upon taking office, FDR moved very quickly to pass legislation that would alleviate the economic burdens created by the Great Depression. Drawing ideas from earlier progressive movements, Congress passed over 15 pieces of major legislation in the first 100 days of FDR's presidency. Never before in American history had Congress been so active. This legislation would become some of the cornerstones of the New Deal and set the tone for the governmental experimentation, which would become a hallmark of the Roosevelt administration. There were a number of programs that were created in the first 100 days, including the CCC, the TVA, NRA, and AAA. Sometimes we call these programs the alphabet soup of government because they contain so many acronyms. These programs are important, and so I'm going to highlight a few of them, organizing them by the problems in which they were meant to solve. Together, these programs, which were all created between 1933 and 1935, will become known as the First New Deal. We will discuss the later New Deal programs in another lecture. So perhaps the most immediate crisis facing the country in 1933 was the collapse of American financial institutions. By 1933, over 5,000 banks had failed and 9 million savings accounts were wiped out in the process. The nation had grown to mistrust the banking system, choosing to hoard money and hide it under their mattresses instead of depositing it in savings accounts. If FDR was to get the United States out of the Great Depression, he would first have to restore the faith in its financial institutions. One of the first acts that was passed by Congress as part of the New Deal was the Emergency Banking Relief Act, sometimes referred to as the bank holiday. As part of the bank holiday, all banks were closed across the country for a period of 4 days, beginning in March of 1933. As part of the act, the government was authorized to examine the finances of banks closed during the bank holiday and reopen those judged to be sound. hopefully in the process reestablishing the public's confidence in the American banking system. In order to do this, Roosevelt used the radio to directly appeal to the American people. In what became known as his fireside chats, Roosevelt broadcast his plan to save the banks to an audience of 35 million people. In his first fireside chat, he gave assurances to the American people that the government was doing what it could to protect their money. His talk eased their fears, and when many of the banks reopened, the public responded by depositing their money back in the banks. These fireside chats would continue throughout his presidency, and Roosevelt's informal addresses over the radio would create a connection between him and the American public. While the Emergency Banking Relief Act prevented America's financial systems from collapsing, FDR still wanted to prevent future bank runs that might jeopardize America's money. Therefore, the government next passed the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act. The Glass-Steagall Act established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, to insure individual bank deposits up to $5,000. The creation of the FDIC ended the bank runs that had occurred frequently at the start of the Great Depression and had led to many of the costly bank failures. The FDIC is still around today and currently insures deposits up to $250,000. Since the start of this program, no depositor has lost any insured funds as a result of a bank failure. Another major action designed to address the financial crisis was the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, in 1934. Many continued to view the largely unregulated stock market and its collapse as a main cause of the Great Depression. Prior to the SEC, the stock market operated more like a casino than a legitimate trading market, with brokers allowing investors to buy stock on a margin and many engaging in insider trading. The SEC served as a watchdog agency, which helped regulate the trading of stocks. The Securities and Exchange Commission still serves that purpose today. And since its creation, companies publicly offering stocks must tell the public the truth about their businesses, the stocks they are selling, and the risks involved in investing. The result is a stock market where investors are treated more fairly and honestly. Now, a second major issue that the New Deal sought to address was the large percentage of Americans who were unemployed. With 1 in 4 Americans out of work, the United States faced the highest levels of joblessness in the nation's history. Roosevelt began to create programs that used federal money to put Americans back to work and at the same time stimulate American industry. One of the first programs passed by Congress to deal with this issue was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. Incredibly popular in its day, the CCC employed young men ages 18 to 25 to work outdoors doing conservation work. During the life of the program, 3 million men would serve in Roosevelt's Tree Army, as the organization came to be called. These men planted hundreds of millions of trees, built fire towers, restocked depleted streams, and maintained the nation's parks, forests, and historic sites. Participants were able to earn $30 a month, much of which they sent back home to their parents. But unfortunately, the limited scope of the CCC meant that it barely made a dent in the unemployment rate at the time. A much more ambitious program was the National Recovery Administration, or NRA. The NRA sought to help the unemployed while simultaneously promoting better labor conditions and helping industry. The main idea behind the NRA was that the government, businesses, and laborers would work together to establish fair competition among all of the different parties. The hope was that the NRA could work with businesses to keep wages high while at the same time keeping the prices of their products low. Some of the policies worked out by the NRA included setting maximum hours for labor, establishing a minimum wage, and guaranteeing workers the right to unionize and bargain collectively. At first, the program was very popular, with participating businesses displaying posters that featured a blue eagle on them and a slogan that read, "We do our part." The enthusiasm for the program was so high that a newly formed professional football team in Philadelphia even made their mascot the Eagles. However, the NRA ultimately failed in its mission to bring about long-term recovery. Those involved in the program were asked to sacrifice too much, and the NRA completely collapsed when the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional in 1935 on the grounds that Congress had delegated legislative powers to the executive branch. The demise of the NRA was a major blow to the New Deal and would mark the beginning of an ongoing struggle between FDR and the more conservative Supreme Court. Now, a third major issue that the New Deal sought to fix was the continued struggles of American farmers. Ever since the end of World War I, farmers had been struggling as a result of falling farm prices. Farm income fell by a staggering 2/3 during the Depression's first 3 years. A bushel of wheat that sold for $2.94 in 1920 dropped to $1 in 1929 and 30 cents in 1932. Farm foreclosures had risen steadily throughout the 1920s, and that trend continued during the Great Depression. The farmers' problem, ironically, was that they grew too much. Widespread crop production soared, but demand fell, causing prices to fall. The dust storms of the 1930s did not help matters. Thus, the government tried to create a program that would increase farm prices so that farmers could more easily support themselves. FDR's solution was the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or AAA. Under the AAA, the government tried to raise prices by reducing the supply of farm goods. Farmers were paid by the government to plow under parts of their crops, and the government purchased livestock to slaughter. The program proved very controversial. Critics of the AAA wondered why food was being destroyed while thousands of citizens went hungry. Yet, as a result of the work of the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, farm prices did begin to rise. Farm incomes doubled between 1933 and 1936, but large farmers reaped most of these benefits. Like the NRA, the AAA was deemed unconstitutional in 1935 by the Supreme Court. But the program was monumental because it established the precedent for a system of farm subsidies, which still exists today. Now, the defunct AAA was replaced by the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act of 1936, which helped prevent overproduction of farmlands by paying farmers to plant soil-conserving crops or leaving some parts of their lands completely uncultivated. Another law that was designed to help Americans in rural areas was the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA. Prior to the New Deal, the Tennessee River Valley region was without electricity and had depleted resources, thus making the area economically depressed. Unfortunately, this was a trend throughout much of rural America in the 1930s. As late as 1935, more than 6 million of America's 6.8 million farmers had no electricity. Unlike Americans living in cities, rural families had not benefited from the growing consumerism of the 1920s, and very few farmers owned washing machines, refrigerators, or vacuum cleaners. Private companies insisted that it would be too expensive to provide electrical service to many of these rural areas. Roosevelt disagreed and started the Tennessee Valley Authority, which became a model for federally guided resource management. The TVA was authorized to build 21 dams to generate electricity for tens of thousands of farm families. Rural electrification programs meant that for the first time, Americans in Appalachia, the Texas Hill Country, and other areas would have the opportunity to share in the benefits of electric lights and running water. The TVA had an added bonus of creating jobs in the construction of these hydroelectric dams. As a result of the program, the government was able to provide cheap electricity to families in the Tennessee River Valley region, create better systems of flood control in the area as well, and conserve the environment of the Tennessee Valley by restoring some of its eroded soil. The TVA served as a model for other resource management programs out west on the Columbia, Missouri, and Colorado rivers. These projects would significantly increase the irrigation systems in the west and allow for its expansion as the 20th century continued. Now, these programs only represent a small portion of the legislation passed during the first New Deal. The New Deal would continue to experiment with other solutions to the Great Depression for the rest of the decade. These New Deal programs were aimed at achieving what FDR called the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief for those who were suffering from the Great Depression, recovery so that our economy could get back on its feet, and reform so that the Great Depression would never happen again. The 3 R's often overlapped and sometimes even got in each other's way. But one thing is for sure. The New Deal and its objectives completely shifted the role of government in the lives of the people. Prior to the New Deal, the federal government existed to defend the country from outside threats, deliver the mail, protect basic rights, and for the most part, stay out of the way. FDR's New Deal changed the role of the federal government by making it responsible for the material well-being of the American people. This is the beginning of the social safety net within the United States, which still exists today. Take care.